Years old when her uncle Jose Zarate began molesting her.
Good morning. Good morning. We brought you the sun. We promised sunshine in Arizona, and here it is. So now you can all go use the water park, but be really careful on that slide. We have one housekeeping. We have General Patton with us here today from the military SAPRO office, who's going to be talking about what the military is doing about sexual assault cases in the military. His session has changed. He needs to leave this afternoon, so it's today from 10:15 to 11:45 in the Noble Room. So I hope that you can, those of you who were planning on attending, can switch up your schedules a little bit. As promised, this morning, we're going to talk about financial fraud. So many times, we focus in on violent crimes, but those who have been victims of financial fraud, their pain lasts for a very long time, sometimes a lifetime, and it causes so much suffering, not just to the individual, but to whole families. So we're going to be talking this morning about how we look at financial fraud, what can be done, and how we can all help victims of financial fraud. I'm going to announce our staff person who recently came on the National Center's staff, Josh Bales. Josh just recently took the bar exam, so if there's any attorneys out there, you'll know that the fact that he's still standing after taking the bar exam is pretty amazing. But he has helped our partners, the FINRA Foundation, put together the guide that is in all your bags. So I'd like you to look at that. If you want more guides to be sent to your offices, we can do that. We think it's going to really be able to help you help victims that find themselves in this situation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh.
Good morning. I did just finish the bar exam in July. It's been over a month, so I won't have any excuse if I stumble over my words. I should have recovered by now, I think. Thank you for being here. So the other day, I'm riding in the car with my son. I pick him up at his preschool. He's 4.5. His name is Gus. He's the cutest child in the world. To get all that out of the way. And Gus and I were riding, and it was shortly after the Boston bombing. And we made a choice, my partner and I made a choice not to tell our son about that. He's 4.5. But as kids do, someone knows something bad happened, and he knows a lot of people got hurt somewhere. So he asked me on the way home, Dad, why do people hurt other people? Well, and if you've ever been around a kid, if you have a niece, a nephew, a grandchild, a child, a close family friend, you know those are the questions that you hope that you can keep the car on the road as you're driving along, because that's kind of a deep question. Why do people hurt people? So I chose to be honest with him and said, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you. And I waited for his reaction. And his reaction came from a television show that some of you may be familiar with. How many of you know who the Care Bears are? Right, the Care Bears. They're those furry little bears that live in Care-a-Lot and drive cloud cars. And they have those pictures on their belly, right? So one has a rainbow. The lion is Braveheart Lion. My son is Braveheart Lion, and he deemed me Grumpy Bear. So I don't know what that tells you. Well, it probably tells you a lot. But he said to me, and the Care Bears, they teach us when we watch the Care Bears that loving and caring always overcomes hurtful things. So my son, after I said I didn't know why people hurt each other, he looked at me in the rearview mirror and he said, that's okay that you don't know, Dad, but you do know that loving and caring always wins against bad choices and hurtful feelings. Yeah, he's 4.5. I'm like trying not to cry, and he's like, why aren't you talking? But out of the mouths of children, right? When I look around this room, I see a bunch of Care Bears, a bunch of people who know that loving and caring can overcome hurtful acts and bad choices. I see a lot of people who, though you probably don't do Care Bear stare, where you put your belly out and shoot a beam of kindness out of your belly. I do hope that some of you do that, although I'm not sure that's victim-centered. But I do know that you are people who care about others. And today what we're talking about is extending that loving and caring to victims of financial fraud, who sometimes are victims that, as Mai alluded to, get overlooked and sometimes don't receive the same wraparound services that we extend to other victims. And so this guide that we produced that you have is designed to help do that better. And we couldn't have done this as a national center without the help of the FINRA Investor Education Foundation. They have been instrumental. They've been great partners to us. They've provided not only financial support, but expertise in the field of investment fraud and just a compassionate, victim-focused view. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce to you this morning Christine Kiefer. So please give her a warm National Center welcome. Christine has been sort of a constant companion for the past 5 months with me. I feel like I talk to her on a regular basis.
It's as if I also took the bar.
Yes, that's true. And so Christine's the senior director at FINRA, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about what FINRA does and about how we partner together.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone at the National Center. This partnership, we'll talk a little bit about how the partnership came about in a little bit, but it really came out because Mai found out about us and came over one day and said, we should talk. We need to know each other. And turns out our offices are only about 4 blocks apart, so it was very convenient. But before I get into the story of financial fraud, I want to introduce you to someone. She's not here with us today. She is still alive. She's just not in this room in our presence today. But her name is Ruth. And imagine a day, probably every day, when you're very busy and you're just trying to get all the stuff done and you are passionate about your job, but at the same time, you just want to get stuff done and check those boxes and move on. And you're in the middle of something and your phone rings, and you know you're supposed to answer it because at least part of my job is answering the phone and talking to not just victims, but investors that have questions and helping them find the right resources. And so my phone rings. It's about 2 p.m, and I really didn't want to answer that phone. But I picked it up. And here was Ruth Mitchell. And she had been a victim of financial fraud. Now, she was not calling me to help her resolve her situation. She had actually already testified before Congress. She had, at the Senate Committee on Aging, she had shared her story widely through the state securities regulator, and we'll talk about what that means shortly. What she came to me for was amplification of her voice. She came to me because she said she heard that we were doing work around investment fraud, and she just wanted people to hear her story. And she felt like she was sharing it, but this had made her such a passionate advocate and a passionate fraud fighter that she wanted to see how she could get involved in what we were doing. And so much of what we've done in the last couple of years has had some, twinge of Ruth involved in it somewhere. And I'll have you know, she lives here, actually, in the Santan Valley, just outside of Phoenix, and I'm going to have dinner with her tonight. So I will certainly let her know what we're doing today, but she was not able to join us. But I want to think about Ruth pretty much while I'm working on investment fraud, because it's not a victimless, faceless crime. And you'll meet a couple of people today who have had situations where they have and continue to struggle with the aftermath of a financial fraud situation. And what we look to you to do as advocates is to bring forward, through reporting and other things that we'll talk about today, bring forward these stories and help victims recover as quickly as they can. So who is FINRA? You can see some of these bullets up here, but I'll try and read these for you. FINRA is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. We are not part of the government, but we are authorized by Congress, and we work with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We oversee all stockbrokers and brokerage firms in the country. And it's our job to write securities. Securities are stocks, bonds, mutual funds, things that are called investment contracts. We oversee securities and people that trade securities. And we work closely with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We write rules, we enforce those rules, we do examinations, we license the professionals that sell these products, and we can disbar, but we don't have criminal authority. We work with the SEC and also with the FBI and others when we have cases to refer out. And FINRA is very dedicated to investor protection and what we call market integrity. Because if there's no integrity in the marketplace, people stop coming. It's very important in our economy that we foster trust, but that it's ethical trust, that it's trust that is deserved. And so market integrity is very important to us, and investor protection. And that's why I'm here today. The FINRA Foundation, which is a subsidiary of FINRA, but focuses really on the outward-facing world. We focus on investors. We focus on the general public, the general consumer. So how many of you today, you don't have to raise your hand, but just think, consider yourself an investor? Okay, and some people want to raise their hand. You can or you don't have to. How many of you don't consider yourself an investor, but you have a retirement 401k or 403b or a savings plan or something like that? Right, but you may not even consider yourself an investor. Well, in fact, you are. Unless you're only investing in treasuries, and so perhaps there are some nuances there. But for the most part, most consumers in the United States are in some way impacted by investor protection efforts and investor education and outreach. And so that's the space that the FINRA Foundation operates in. And we want to help people make informed choices, not just around fraud, but just around decisions that they make around their 401k and decisions that they make in saving for their future. Well, why are we focusing on financial fraud? Well, financial fraud itself, and I'm going to borrow a definition from the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force, and I point over here because there's someone you'll hear from later who gets involved in the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force, but it encompasses really a wide range of illegal behavior around finance, and anyone can be a victim. And we're going to talk about different perspectives of what financial fraud can mean. While the FINRA Foundation is most closely aligned with investment fraud, and you could imagine, the Ponzi schemes that you hear about in the news very typically have some sort of investment fraud component. There's all sorts of other ways in which financial fraud is perpetrated, and so we're going to talk about that today. But prevalence is much broader than we think. So there are some studies that indicate that between 12 and 15% of people are victims of financial fraud. However, this is self-reporting data, and there's tremendous underreporting with financial fraud. That's a critical issue that we'll be talking to you about, ways that you can help with that. And there's also many different ways in which we measure what financial fraud can mean, because there's lots of different activities that classify themselves, that could fall under the banner of what financial fraud is. So it's measured in lots of different ways. There's many instances where we're not able to measure it because people are not coming forward. So we don't actually know how big the problem is. But we have some indications that it's affecting people far and wide around the country, households of high net worth and households of low net worth, in communities, small communities and in large communities. And so no matter where you live, investment fraud and other financial frauds could be taking place in your community. The Financial Fraud Research Center is a center that the FINRA Foundation started with the Stanford Center on Longevity in California. And the purpose of the Financial Fraud Research Center is to try to better consolidate the research that's taking place around financial fraud and the statistics that we have and better share them. So as you think about the issue, or if you need to find some statistics to share in a report, I encourage you to check out the Financial Fraud Research Center and as well as the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force, and look for some of their data. And all of these URLs and things that we're going to talk about today are in this, the Advocate's Guide that's in the yellow bags that you received at registration. So you'll be able to hopefully find them there as well. We have some new research from the FINRA Foundation that's coming out actually on Thursday, so you're getting a little preview, very first preview, so don't go and report it to everybody. But the new FINRA Foundation research found that financial fraud solicitations are very commonplace. Solicitations. Now, I'm not saying everybody that's solicited falls victim, because that's very different. But the solicitations are commonplace. And we found that more than 8 in 10 who were solicited in our survey. So 80% of, if you extrapolated that out, are solicited in some way. So think about, do any of you receive the spam emails that say the stock is getting hot and hotter, you must get in now? In some way you've been solicited, right? Or maybe you received a letter in the mail that said you won a lottery, or that you are a beneficiary to some person's estate who you've never met. I guess it's a long-lost relative from Canada. Solicitations are happening all the time in that way to many people. And of those 80%, 11% said that they actually lost money after engaging in the offer in some capacity. But the inability to recognize the red flags of fraud, this inability to really internalize what the pitch is and pull out what the flag should be, is prevalent. We have difficulty, but we're surrounded by persuasion and influence and sales tactics all the time, and we're going to talk about that. And so this inability in general to sort of separate out what should be red flags for us is causing people to engage in fraudulent offers. And our study found that upon being solicited, older investors, so 65 plus is where we categorized that, and you could cut it many ways, but were 34% more likely to engage in the offer. Now, this is not just a problem of older Americans. This is a problem of every American. But older Americans are most at risk. And underreporting is a tremendous concern. Now, I want you to think in your mind, why don't people report? Why don't people report? Josh, tell me, what do you think the most common reason people don't report is?
I'm on the spot. I would say fear, shame, fear of embarrassment, fear of admitting that they were victims.
And that is what most people in our field say to me. People don't report, and up on stages they say, oh, people don't report because they're ashamed and they're afraid, and that is true. But according to our study, it's not the primary reason they don't report. The first is that it would not have made a difference. And the second is that they didn't know where to turn. So that's your importance in this role. That's your role here, is that we can all come together and help people find where they need to turn, find those places of support, and help them understand that it does make a difference. It does make a difference. It may not make a difference in their bank account, but it makes a difference. Just like all the other talks yesterday with the DNA and talking about, the sooner you can catch someone, the less harm they're doing to someone else. Very quickly, one of the things that the FINRA Foundation focuses on heavily is persuasion and influence. And we've steeped ourselves in the study of financial fraud from the perspective of sales tactics and persuasion. And I have here a graphic that explains a little bit, just sort of the 5 key areas that we focus on. We analyzed a series of transcripts and other cases and just really narrowed it down to what are the influence tactics most commonly used to perpetrate financial fraud, and specifically, in this case, it was specifically investment fraud. And how can we teach people, because we focus a lot on prevention, How can we teach people to recognize those flags before it's too late? Now, one representation of these tactics that I'm using here today, many, actually we use them all the time, legitimately. But I'm using one specifically right here. This is called source credibility, right? Because if I told you I was from DC, from some financial regulator, and I came up here in my capri pants and my flip-flops that I flew out on the plane in, you would not believe that I knew what I was talking about. You may say, well, of course I would. I wouldn't judge like that. But we all do it. It's part of how our society is developed. We build trust with people through many ways, through our appearance, through the way we groom ourselves, through the choice in our clothing, to the credentials on our business cards, in many ways, to the certificates on the walls in our office, the number of windows in your office, right? You don't want to go to a financial professional that works in a basement apartment that doesn't look very clean. You want somebody that has the trappings of success. That's a moment of source credibility. And there are things that you can do from the prevention side to try to separate out what things should be used to judge your trust or not. For instance, when it comes to selling investments, salespeople have to be registered with FINRA, their state securities regulator, or the Securities and Exchange Commission. And you can look that up for free on the internet. It's not like a credit pull. Nobody knows you've looked them up. They don't know anything about it. And you can find out about their disciplinary history, their employment history. They jump from job to job, the licenses that they hold, that they actually pass the examinations. So there's some things that we can teach people from a prevention side, and we're not going to focus a ton on prevention today, that can hopefully slow down the decision-making process and give them some speed bumps along the way or some decision points along the way that help them weed out these tactics that are being deceptively used and the tactics that are just socially used, because we all use them. One more example of a tactic is reciprocity. Has anyone been invited to a free lunch or dinner seminar before? Timeshare, maybe a weekend timeshare presentation, right? I'm not saying these things are fraudulent, but they're full of persuasion tactics, that's for sure. That's a reciprocity tactic. And the more that we receive from someone else, the more indebted we are, and the more likely we are to say yes. So in the case of a free investment dinner or lunch, you may say, I'm going to go, I'm never going to buy anything. They may even say, don't bring your checkbook, nothing will be sold. But you're more likely to accept the follow-up call if you got the free chicken first. We gave you free lunch here yesterday, too, didn't we? Because we wanted you to stay. It's all about persuasion, and we're not using it deceptively, but everybody uses it. It's something we're very comfortable receiving. We're comfortable receiving persuasion, and sometimes it makes us uncomfortable. Like you go and buy a new car, or I always use the example, you walk into Sears because you know you need a refrigerator, but someone's going to come and talk to you about it. You don't really want to hear from them, but you kind of do. We're around it all the time, and that's what makes it so difficult to separate out when it's coming at us from a fraudulent perspective. That's what makes it so difficult. And the perpetrators use tremendous range of emotion, but it really centers in on a couple of key points. They use compassion. Messages, they profile the victims first and get to know what their likes and needs and wants are. And I'm focusing mostly on the work I've done with investment fraud here, so there's certainly a range. But focus on what's important to you. Maybe it's saving money for your grandchildren, sending someone to college, and they use that compassion. Oh, don't you want to have a good nest egg for your future family? Don't you want to show them you've been successful? They focus in on compassion. They also focus in on fear, because fear is a motivator. And fear usually comes sort of towards the end of a pitch or later in a relationship. But fear is very powerful in spurring us into action. And so it may be that they've convinced us to get interested and listen a little bit to a pitch, maybe about some investment that they're pitching, and we haven't really quite moved yet. And then there's the scarcity pitch, like, oh, I'm almost out of product, or there's only a few days left to get in on this. Please don't tell anybody. This is really exclusive. You're the only people I'm inviting in. And so they put fear in you that you're going to miss out on something that they've convinced you that you already have. Because they've already convinced you. You've already spent that $100,000 that they said they were going to make you. Right? You've already started figuring out where you're going to divvy up those profits. And so fear is powerful. And the last is affinity and social acceptance. And I would in no way mean to pick on religion, but many, many Ponzi schemes and investment frauds have happened, have spurred themselves and grown through religious ties. And that's just a social acceptance and an affinity tactic. People find ways to shortcut trust-building scenarios, and they use those then to perpetrate their own frauds. But the cons agree. Victims they agree on a couple of things when we've talked to them. Victims get excited, and they act on impulse. And we're doing some work at Stanford right now with the Financial Fraud Research Center and with the Center for Psychology with fMRI brain scanning. And we're looking at impulse control as it relates to fraud susceptibility. And there's a fair amount of research that's showing that there's something there to be looked at further. Victims also don't ask questions, they answer questions. So some of our prevention methods is answering, is asking, being proactive, being strong. That often victims don't read the information, but they rely on a salesman to tell them what this says. And I want to tell you, before I go any further, that there are definitely victims that defy all of this. And two of them are sitting here at the table. At least I know Carolyn. She reads, she asks questions, they still had some difficulties, and we'll hear about the fraud they were involved in a little bit. So it's not universal, but as a general rule, victims tend to be led. And I like to differentiate it between solicited and unsolicited. Victims are most typically victimized when they get involved in something that was unsolicited. They weren't out looking for something. It stumbled on them, and they got involved. And this is something, the last point is a point that behavioral economists and psychologists are calling confirmation bias, where we are interested in confirming our own beliefs more than we're interested in defying our own beliefs. So once someone is being brought into a story that something is legitimate, they're more likely to look for reasons that it's true than to look for the reasons that it's not. And this happens across the board with financial management in general, not just frauds, but confirmation bias is something it's a bias in all of us where we have a tendency to want to confirm. We want to believe. We want to confirm what we already believe. We don't want to think that we could be taken. I'm now going to turn it back to Josh to cover a little bit of the points about how victims recover from fraud.
So early on in our process, and indeed the project was designed to be focused on recovery because we recognize there are lots of prevention resources available in the world, more today than there were, say, 20 years ago. And we wanted something, as the National Center often does, that focuses on helping victims recover. When I was 12 years old, I learned that my grandfather had been the victim of investment fraud. He'd invested over a quarter of his retirement nest egg and my grandmother's retirement nest egg in a land deal that was entirely bogus. He didn't invest it with a random person. It was someone he'd known since childhood, a business associate, a fellow insurance salesman, someone who skipped town with the money shortly thereafter and retired somewhere south of Kentucky. I'm from Kentucky, by the way, if you can't tell by my minimal accent that I have. But he was a victim of investment fraud, and I remember talking to my grandmother and asking her why she was upset. And she told me it's because this wasn't just a crime against us, it was a crime against you. Because someday I'm going to leave whatever I have left, or I'm going to need to survive on whatever retirement income we have left, and maybe there won't be enough, and it's something you may have to worry about. Now, I was 12 years old, and I didn't understand that. I just wanted to watch Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or whatever I did at 12. But that stuck with me, that it was a crime against me. Financial fraud is a crime against generations of people, because it doesn't just affect the person that's a victim, it affects their family members, and it affects all of us in society. But there are some barriers to recovery that we identified. When my grandfather was in the early stages of Alzheimer's when he made his land sale deal. That's part of the reason that he missed some of the red flags. He was not thinking with his full capacity. And once the crime happened in 1993, they didn't really know where to go. The bank said it's not our problem. There wasn't, they didn't know that they needed to call a state authority. There wasn't anyone to tell them in a small town in Kentucky. So they didn't know where to go. And not knowing where to turn is a huge barrier. I think about this when I'm driving down the road with my navigator up on my window. So, when I first started driving when I was 16, there was no such thing. So I had to read a map, right? How many of you read maps? You still read maps? Really? Wow, that's impressive. Bunch of Luddites in here. No offense. You're supposed to say none taken to that. There you go. So, with a navigator, it tells me where to turn. It says turn left in 50 feet. Somehow I still manage to miss that sometimes. But it tells me where to go. But if I don't have that now, there are times I've gotten lost in my own town where I live or on my way to work in the morning because the nav's not turned on. So I've gotten dependent on that. But that's a helpful guide, and a lot of financial fraud victims don't have that guide. Fear of losing esteem or prestige, fear of being embarrassed for being duped. People feel like they were duped, like they're dumb for what happened. That's not an uncommon feeling, and it's just not true. As Christine talked about, the persuasion tactics that involve investment fraud, mortgage and lending fraud, and mass marketing fraud are what pull people in. It's not an intelligence level that prevents you from being tricked into making a poor investment, say. It's the strength of the persuasion tactics. But that embarrassment's a huge burden. For instance, if someone breaks into your house or into your hotel room today and breaks the window, people aren't going to say to you most of the time, the door's locked. They're not going to say to you, well, you should have barred your hotel window doors, of course. That's not how we think about burglary, and it's not how we should think about financial fraud. It's something that happens because of persuasion tactics. So that fear of losing control is really important. Perpetrators can also often be threatening, and this really involves folks who are dependent on the caregivers who are stealing from them or doing fraudulent acts on their behalf. This would involve people who are victims of elder abuse. Also, domestic violence victims, as many of you know, are often victims of financial fraud because their batterer uses the power and control they have over the victim, and they extend that to the financial world as well. So those threats and intimidation are real barriers to actually seeking help. Also, if it's your friend or family member who's going to go to jail for this behavior, sometimes you're more reluctant to report it. My grandfather didn't want to report it because even though this person had done a horrible thing to him, stolen over a quarter of his retirement income, he was his friend he went to high school with. He didn't want to report it. And that sounds at first to me, when I heard it, I was like, really? When I hear the story retold, I said, really? He didn't want to report it? But it makes sense. If my brother, who I love very much, takes something from me, when I was a kid, sure, I would run and tell mom and dad right away. But what did my parents always say to me? Don't tattletale. That's right. And we learn that about people that we love. We're not supposed to tell on them. And so that's a barrier. And also, there's a lack of confidence in the ability of authorities to respond. And folks, that's not unwarranted. We're getting better and better. Our authorities are getting better and better at responding. But we still have a long way to go. There's still a lot of, I can take a report, but I can't do anything for you. And so part of the reason we created this guide is to help connect people to places who say, I can take a report, but I can't do anything. Because the more reports that come in, the more obvious the problem is to people, and the more willing they are to begin to take further steps. We've been talking a lot about fraud, and when we say fraud, we think investment fraud, lending fraud, mortgage fraud, mass marketing fraud. But one of the other things we included in the guide is identity theft. Now, identity theft isn't a fraud on the front end the same way a lot of times investment fraud is. It's an actual theft. I mean, it's in the name. Someone takes someone else's identity and then does fraudulent things with the identity. The taking may not be fraudulent at all because you don't even know about it. They didn't dupe you out of giving your identity away. They went to the doctor's office and stole medical records that have your social security number, which, by the way, you don't have to give your doctor's office, and I recommend that you don't, because a lot of identity theft victims are victims because those are stolen from a doctor's office. That also gives rise to a negligent security claim, potentially, of your identity that you can pursue a civil remedy on. But folks don't know these things because no one's been talking about that in that context. So there are barriers to recovery for identity theft victims, which include not even knowing that it occurred for a long period of time. And so today we wanted to invite someone who's had experience with identity theft, who's been a victim of identity theft, to talk to us. So I want you to give a warm welcome to Catherine Shearer, who's been an identity theft victim, and she's going to come talk to us about her experience. So let's welcome her. Okay. Thank you. Good morning, Catherine. Thanks for joining us. So, Catherine, will you tell us a little bit about when the identity theft in your situation, when your identity was first stolen, and then when you first found out about it?
My identity was first stolen in 2000 when I was 13. I found out about it in 2008 when I went to change houses and get new services at a new city, and they said I had past due accounts and they couldn't supply electricity to my house.
And when you found out, what was your initial response when they said to you, have these past due accounts?
Well, my initial response was to prove that I didn't and to file a police report, but I also think that's because of my education, being ready to enter law school at that time.
And tell me, what's been the effect of the identity theft on your financial situation as well as other areas of your life? How's it affected you?
Well, while I can't go into too much detail because my case is still open, I'm dealing with a few foreclosed mortgages, child support payments, a divorce decree. I've been audited by the IRS because I've claimed all these dependents on my taxes, which I had my first child before I think I was able to bear children. I was lucky enough to fight for a new Social Security number, and I was granted that. Unfortunately, that new number is an 800 number, so no financial institutions recognize it. So it comes back as being invalid. And I just can't even explain. I mean, trying to fight to just get a checking account when I've done nothing wrong, and trying to fight with the credit bureaus because my situation was unique in that there are two separate credit reports, one with my name and one with his name, both with my Social Security number. So I kept running into roadblocks when they told me that it would violate his privacy to be able to be granted access to any of that information.
Absolutely. So it sounds like that the system in some ways feels like it's stacked against you. Is that a fair assessment?
What I've learned is that he doesn't have to prove anything. I have to prove who I am. And he's gotten away with not having to deal with anything, actually.
And do you know how your identity was stolen? How did he get the information? Can you tell us about that?
You know, we've thought time and time again about this. My parents always kept my Social Security in a safety deposit box. And the only thing we can think of is that it might have come from a doctor's office, because this is back in the day when you had to provide that information. But from what the defendant said, he got it from a family member who got it from a family member.
And, I think I want to...
Not my family members.
Right.
His family
Okay,
members.
that's a good clarification. And I think that's an important point, is that sometimes a person's Social Security number in particular will travel between multiple individuals. And so where there might be one perpetrator in some situations, like here you have a single perpetrator, you could have multiple, 5, 10 different people doing 10 different things with a Social Security number. So I think that's important for folks to recognize. Tell us a little bit about what the emotional impact has been for you.
Well, I was raised to work hard. Full scholarship to my undergrad degree, full scholarship to law school, only to pass the bar and still not be licensed. And I took the bar in 2012, February of 2012. So that's been hard.
It's okay.
I'm really sorry. It's been really hard to work hard and always, be told that if you work hard, you'll get what you want. And have somebody that you don't know and who still says that he never thought it would hurt anybody be able to ruin my entire life.
Sure. Well, I think you're very brave for sharing that with us. Thank you for that. Catherine, I want to turn now and ask you, where have you encountered assistance? Who's been particularly helpful to you in this process? In terms of authorities, advocates, what's been helpful?
I filed with the city of Mason my initial police report, and they took it. They said they couldn't do anything. But a week later, I got a call from the FBI because of the mortgage fraud, and that was the first time that detective, his name is Detective Griebler, and he was beyond amazing. I would email him, and he would get back to me every week. But that still went on for 5 years during the case, and he couldn't provide me with any information at all. And not until I decided to run for political office next year did I want to try to find a board that I could sit on. So I contacted the Arizona Identity Theft Coalition, and within an hour I got an email back from Kathleen Wynn, and she's the Director of Community Outreach at the Arizona Attorney General's office, and she said, why don't you come in and talk, and we'll see what we can do for you. And so 5 years after I found out was the first time that somebody really stepped forward, and she's been very proactive in helping me clear up some of my issues.
That's great. And Kathleen Wynn was here yesterday presenting one of our breakout sessions, and Nick is sitting over at the table who's with the Arizona Identity Theft Coalition. And I know they've been really helpful to you, and that as an example of what an advocate can do, can reach out. I mean, it's unfortunate that it took 5 years to connect that way, but that they were able to reach out at that point is really helpful. Let me ask you a question. You have a lot of victim advocates in here. I've termed them potentially Care Bears. Mm-hmm. I saw you smiling at that term. And what could these victim advocates know? What do they need to know about what they can do that would be more helpful for victims in particular of identity theft?
I think the issue is that my victim advocate didn't get assigned until charges were filed against the defendant. And so I had already spent 5 years trying to get through the mud myself. My victim advocate has been very good, and I think because I've already cleared up a lot of issues that there wasn't a lot for her to do. But I kept getting, when I would ask certain questions, that it was outside her scope of employment. She couldn't provide me with those answers. And, you have to understand on a personal level, even if it might be outside the scope of your employment, you should ask, hey, have you sought any counseling? Here are the state services that could maybe help you and provide free counseling. Or, I understand it's not in your job description, but it would be nice to just have that little extra email, that little extra phone call to say, hey, how are you doing?
Absolutely. That makes really good sense. And what can you tell us about the status of your case? Where is the criminal case ongoing? What can you tell us about that?
The criminal case is ongoing. We're looking at hopefully a plea acceptance next week, and then I can start working on getting licensed. But if he does not accept the plea, then we will be going to trial. The issue with identity theft cases is that sometimes it's hard to show that the intent. So not all of the crimes are included in the case, and therefore I still have to go and prove that those credit cards and those cars are not mine, which is quite difficult. I love going into court. I think I've been sued over 20 times now. I'm hoping he'll accept the plea and I can start moving forward with life. But at this time, I'm trying to work on getting my name out of that child support document and out of that divorce. So I think it's just one day at a time, and I'm sure I'll be dealing with this 10 years down the road still.
Sure. And then what can you tell us? I know that you mentioned running for political office, so I think it'd be interesting to know what some of your sort of goals and what this office you're running for is, why you're running for it, and what some of your hopes for the near-term future are.
Well, clearly plan A, B, and C in my life didn't really work out, so I had to go to another plan. And I've volunteered over 1,000 hours in the justice courts in Arizona, and mediating. And I really liked being able to help others, and I've encountered multiple identity theft on credit cards and them being sued and not knowing that they had a card. So I decided to run for Justice of the Peace in McDowell Mountain District next year. And hopefully if I don't win by that time, my license might come through and I might be able to start helping other victims that were in my situation, because unfortunately I tried calling attorneys and they wanted money, and I understand that is the occupation I am getting into, but sometimes it's just not, it wasn't possible and wasn't feasible, and I just could not find somebody that cared enough, which is funny because I'm assuming most of the attorneys in this room, if your license was held up, it would affect you in some way as well. So.
Well, absolutely. Having just taken the bar myself, I really can't imagine what that feels like, not to be able to be seated having passed the bar. And so, I think but it's really admirable to me that you're reaching out already, working to help others, running for office and doing those things is really an admirable thing. And I really honor your willingness to share with us honestly today, to tell us about your experience, the good and the bad. I think that's helpful for all of us here to hear, and it's a helpful reminder. I've talked to a number of victims of identity theft and other financial fraud, and I've not met anyone that's as eloquent as Catherine's been here today and as willing to share as she was today. If you're in Arizona and you want to talk to somebody, and if you're an Arizona attorney, I really encourage you to get in touch with her, not only for her story, but she's an excellent student. She did really well, better than me in law school. And I'm not saying I did really great. I'm not saying I'm a great, intelligent mind. I'm saying she did better than me, though. And she's part of the reason we created this guide, because she deserves better than to have to wait 5 years to get help. She deserves better than that. And we can do better because we're the people with the love and compassion to make it better. So, Catherine, thank you so much for being up here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was great.
Yeah, sorry.
No apology necessary. So, Catherine really painted a picture. I almost don't need to talk. I can sit down and put this slide up, and you can make the connections. The cost of financial fraud and identity theft are immense. Yesterday at the Bar Association, one of their breakout sessions, we talked about the neurobiology of trauma. Trauma shows up in many different ways, and sometimes we don't associate what happens to victims of identity theft and financial fraud as being trauma. We think of someone who's been a victim of violent crime or seen a violent crime occur or been a victim of long-term abuse. But trauma shows up in these feelings that you see on the screen. The denial, the fear, the guilt, the shame, isolation, anger, loss of self-confidence, a higher rate of depression among victims of financial fraud. The cost of financial fraud on the emotional and mental well-being of its victims is very high. And so we wanted to make sure that whatever guide we released was victim-centered and victim-affirming for that very reason. There are also some other costs. You heard Catherine talk about those costs in identity theft. It's been 5 years since she discovered that she was a victim of identity theft. She's still, 5 years later, working through getting her name off of a child support document, a child that she could probably not have physically had. So the time and money, and we're talking, Catherine here is very high functioning, right? So she doesn't have any additional barrier that, say, many of your clients will show up with, perhaps a capacity issue, or perhaps they're very dependent on a caretaker. And so they have to do all this extra work over and above, maybe just their job every day. It's hard enough to go to law school, much less to have this hanging over your head. So you can lose, obviously, your lifetime savings, retirement income. Many lose their home or the equity in their home, which is still, for some people, their major nest egg. And important for a lot of victims who are victims of elder abuse or who are senior adults, the ability to live independently can sometimes be taken away. And that's really important to remember. Also, it's important to remember that how many of you had a credit check run on you when you started employment wherever you work? So I had a credit check run on me, and apparently I passed, and that's great. But if my identity had been stolen, that credit check might have come back with, like we've heard, multiple loans, past due car accounts, you know, that I owe child support in other states if that's reported to the credit reporting agency. And it may restrict me from getting employment. Also, if my Social Security number has been used for employment purposes, I might not be able to even get a job. They might not be able to offer it to me because company policy won't allow it. So identity theft can really affect a wide range of people's lives, all areas, both emotional, mental, as well as their financial well-being. And Christine's going to talk to us a little bit about why we chose to move beyond simple prevention or warning campaigns into something about recovery.
So a couple of years ago, when the Finner Foundation started focusing on investment fraud as a prevention issue, we did a study where we looked at some OECD research and others around social change campaigns that show impact. Because we didn't want to just put out a bunch of new bulletins. Now, don't get me wrong, the FINRA issues investor alerts and investor bulletins, and the Securities and Exchange Commission does it, and DOJ does it, and many of us do that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we wanted to see if we could go beyond warning people and be more, perhaps sort of from a prevention side at least, have a more sustaining impact. And according to OECD and others, it really came down to these characteristics that make campaigns and outreach and this kind of model effective. It's moving to this educating campaign from a warning campaign. So instead of me telling you what that stock spam email said to me, it's recognizing the characteristics of what a stock spam email has, or recognizes the characteristics of a pitch that could help someone learn to identify what the flags are. We need to be more generic, more proactive, and really build skills in consumers. And this was our angle into building a prevention campaign. And all of you are looking at me going, is she going to talk about prevention the whole time? Josh is talking about these victims. This is great. We really need that. Well, we started really focusing with prevention. And then Mai came along, and we met and we said, you know, there's a gap in what we're providing. We've been building a campaign. We have lots of partnerships with the National Crime Prevention Council and the Better Business Bureau and crime prevention associations and all sorts of groups that are out there trying to educate people. But what about the person who's already been victimized, or who's on the verge of being victimized and wants to go to someone and say, I think there's something here. How can you help me? How do we help those people? And that's where our partnership came about. We decided that together we could join forces and really focus on emphasizing recovery in our efforts, to use victim-affirming and victim-centered approaches as is at the root of what the National Center is focused on. And we could develop resources for advocates that are easy to use. So our goal is to provide things to you that if you've never had an identity theft victim or a fraud victim or a mortgage fraud or a lending fraud or if you've never had that type of financial fraud victim come to you before, but you have this resource and you hear something, you may realize there's a lot more noise happening around you in this space than you knew. And you may be able to represent, or you may be able to provide some guidance to someone. Even if it's as simple as, in the case of investment fraud, even if it's as simple as saying, did you know there's such a thing as a state securities regulator, and here they are, here's their phone number. Call them. They're the first place to start. Even if you just give the first phone number to that person, it's a number they probably didn't have. And so we work together to bring a guide to you that Josh is going to go through in just a minute that really covers what the steps are that you can take and how to set expectations for victims. And Josh is going to go through the guide a little bit, and we'll be back talk about the actual frauds.
So when we're putting together this guide, and so you can see, I'm going to hold a copy here. You all have one, but when we put together Taking Action, an advocate's guide to assisting victims of financial fraud, we had some things in mind, some things that you're not surprised that the National Center cares about. We wanted it to be holistic. And what we mean by that is we wanted to pay attention to both financial recovery as well as emotional and mental recovery, as well as the safety of victims, both financial and personal safety. We wanted it to give information about both civil and criminal recovery. Sometimes there's a tendency in recovery to focus criminal approaches to recovery to the exclusion of civil, but we wanted to make sure we included civil recovery because that sometimes offers the best way for victims to make some type of financial recovery as well as emotional recovery, as they can hold their perpetrator accountable. But we wanted it to set realistic expectations for both the advocate and victim. We didn't want to promise the world because we can't deliver that. We wanted to help advocates set expectations so that victims know what to expect as they encounter this web. We wanted to provide clear action steps so that the steps victims take are obvious and clear based on the way that they're phrased. We didn't want them to have to do a lot of guesswork. We wanted to connect them with the resources. We're going to talk about the Federal Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force in a minute, which has done great work in including and furthering the federal response. And we wanted to connect them with that. And most importantly to me was we wanted it to be victim-centered, victim-affirming. We wanted our guide to empower victims. We wanted it to affirm their experience, and we wanted it to help them share and tell their story. Because that's what inspires me to do the work I do, and I believe what inspires you to do the work that you do. And so in doing so, we have it divided up in 4 categories. We have laying the foundation, which provides background information on financial fraud. Say you're new to this and you want some information. This provides you with that information and also helps you connect to resources for more. We have the advocate's role, which describes what we think your job is as you're working with a victim of financial fraud, including 2 important areas we'll talk more about in a minute, prevention and networking. We have our action steps. They're active, they're steps, they're moving in progress that we'll discuss what is in there in a few more minutes. And we have some additional resources to point you in the right direction. And our first section is laying the foundation. And in laying the foundation provides, as you see, a basic outline of the prevalence, some of the statistics you've heard here, helps us understand and illustrate the costs, provides access to the latest research that, especially that FINRA has been doing, and outlines the major categories of fraud. We've already talked about them, but the major categories that we point to are identity theft, which is the most common right now statistically that we know of these 4, investment fraud, which is also very common and we focused on, mortgage and lending fraud. Many people, especially with the economic downturn here in Arizona in particular, have been victims of that. And then mass marketing and other fraud. There are lots of frauds that really primarily involve advanced fee schemes. And so these major categories, this last category captures those advanced fee scheme frauds. And then in our advocate role section, we really worked hard to encourage a victim-centered approach. We wanted assistance for you all in identifying fraud, so there's some basic questions for you to ask that help sort of the victim explain their story if you're getting them without knowing what's really going on. We wanted to help you set expectations, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And we wanted to connect advocates to prevention resources because prevention is still really important. And what we know statistically and what Christine has helped me learn is that once you're a victim of a fraud, you're much more likely to be a victim of another fraud again. So we need to help victims prevent becoming victims again. That's sort of like financial safety planning, if you will. And we really wanted to encourage you all to network in your local community. What we heard in our roundtables and focus groups is that there's not enough networking and connecting people to resources. So we provided some suggestions for how to do that and for how you can connect with your law enforcement officials, your district attorney, civil attorneys, adult protective services to make sure you're making the financial fraud connection in these areas. In terms of setting expectations, these are some things we wanted to make sure that were expectations that victims had. And you can see them. They're pretty self-explanatory, but I think they're helpful for victims to know. Recovery is going to require work. Catherine illustrated just how much work it's going to require from victims. Reporting matters. So a lot of times we're hearing victims report it to one place, and they think that's enough. I told my local police department. Well, the problem is the local police department may or may not be reporting it to a federal agency, to federal law enforcement, to the district attorney. No matter what your point of entry is, it's important to report as many places as you can, because that helps in the law enforcement response. Full financial recovery, as you may know, is often difficult to achieve. Why is that? Well, it's because a fraudster doesn't hold on to your money, put it in a 6% return investment account, and let it sit there. That's not how it works. They spend it. They use it. It's gone. Many of them are, as attorneys say, judgment-proof. There's nothing to sue. But the banks have responsibilities in this. Credit reporting agencies have responsibilities. Doctors' offices have responsibilities to protect your records. There are lots of places that provide some level of financial recovery, but most folks don't get back even a small percentage of what was taken. Civil legal action, as I've alluded to, is possible. And we say, but it may not work, because we don't want victims to think, well, I've got a lawyer, I'm going to sue this guy, I'm going to get my $500,000 back, I'm going to get my 20 grand, my 5 grand back. That's how it's going to work. That's not how it works, but we want them to consider civil legal remedies. We want them to talk to an attorney, to consider doing it, because that might provide them an angle on recovery that's really helpful and empowering. We want victims to know resources are available. There are lots of them. We want to then connect it to that. We want them to know that recovery is not just about getting money back or getting back in a financial safe place. It's about health, both mental, physical, and emotional health. We want to connect them with those resources. And we want them to know, and this is a difficult one, that there might be silence. And what we mean is that you might report it and you might not hear back. You might report it to an agency that doesn't have the capacity to get back with you. And we want them to know that that doesn't mean that your claim's bad or invalid. It doesn't mean that what happened to you isn't real and devastating. What it means is that they're not capable of reporting that, of doing anything beyond taking a report. So those are some of the expectations that we've tried to set in this guide that we think are helpful for victims. Now we want to introduce to you two of the loveliest people I've ever met who experienced investment fraud. And we're going to watch a short introductory video, and then we'll meet them and talk to them in person.
Winters in Maine are long and cold. Snow falls in October, often covering the land through March. It takes a lot of energy to keep the state warm and running in winter. Carolyn Thompson, here with husband Ray, Maine natives, knows that. And that's one reason the two invested $30,000 in an alternative energy company with a new windmill technology.
Green energy everybody wants green energy, and they're just so hopeful that green energy is going to be the answer to our environmental problems and money problems, and it just seemed to fit the bill.
It sounded too good to be true. It was. The alternative energy company was a scam. There were no new windmills, just a slick-talking con man by the name of James Rivera, who stole from Carolyn and many others.
He was very convincing that he had all the ducks in a row. He had them all in place, had the big names.
The company, Almighty Wind, looked great on paper. Good scams usually do. Carolyn, who volunteers at her church, heard about the deal from a trusted friend, and that was good enough for her. She never really checked out James Rivera or saw whether the investment was registered.
In the case of the Thompsons not only were brought in by their friends who had a common interest in green energy, but they in turn brought others into the scheme. That's how that whole concept of social consensus works. The idea is that like-minded people who have similar interests and who know one another and therefore trust one another become interested in something that might turn out to be a scam, and in this case did.
Carolyn and Ray had hoped the wind energy investment would provide a nest egg for the children and grandchildren. They have learned hard lessons.
I'll be a little more skeptical of investments. Is check with some state organizations to see if they're registered.
As for James Rivera, he was convicted of fraud and is serving a 12-year prison sentence.
I'd like to welcome Ray and Carolyn Thompson. Careful, it's a little stick here. So thank you for joining us. Ray and Carolyn came from Maine yesterday, and I was really pleased that the rain stopped just as they were landing, because I thought, we've got to show them some good Arizona sunshine. So, Carolyn, tell us a little bit about what happened and how you got involved.
Okay, first I'd like to tell you a little bit about Ray and me, to kind of set the scene a little bit. I have a Bachelor of Arts, or actually a Bachelor of Science from the University of Maine in Orono. I was the executive director of Literacy Volunteers in Bangor for about 8 years. And I have a wellness business, and I've had a lot of other part-time jobs. Ray has owned a hardware store in a little town in Maine for 32 years. He was in financial services business and wellness business as well. And
what bothers me about this, the financial services, my position there, I used to do financial seminars throughout Maine, teaching people how to be smart with their money. What am I doing here?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about that. We had a phone call from a friend who we were actually in the wellness business with them. Very dear people, very honest people, good Christian people. We'll bring religion into it a little bit. They don't push religion on us. We just know that they're good, honest, wholehearted people. We met with them for dinner. He showed us the business. We went home, listened to a conference call, thought about it, met with them again, saw more information. It was sort of a mini business plan that James Rivera had sent paperwork to them. We listened to more conference calls and decided we'd like to invest. It sounded good. All the big names were there. As I said, wind energy. I don't know about where all of you are from, but in Maine, it's big right now. We decided to invest. We listened to just about every conference call, and they actually were webinars. We bought a computer because our old one would not bring up the webinars, but we could, on a new computer, bought that so that we could watch what he was presenting as we were on the conference calls. In April of that year, this started in January, in April of that year, we went to Las Vegas. James was having a training and unveiling of a working windmill. Well, we got there. The training really wasn't as much training as socializing. He walks in Friday night, and here he's meeting a lot of his investors, and he has Bermuda shorts on and a cigar. And my first impulse was to go to him and say, James, put your cigar out. I have allergies, which I did. It's funny how some people will intimidate you and you just kind of shrink back, but I kind of bristled up a bit against this fellow. We were supposed to receive stock certificates in the company, but there was always an excuse. We were supposed to receive them there in Las Vegas. The lawyer turned out to be his wife's godfather. His wife was there, and apparently he wasn't divorced from his first wife, so he really didn't have a second wife yet. I had investigated the company a little bit. I didn't think to put his name in the computer, but I did put the company names, and it was incorporated in Nevada, which I was told that Nevada is a place that a lot of people invest or incorporate because it's so easy to get it incorporated in Nevada. When we got to Las Vegas, it was supposed to be recorded so that we would have copies of all the training. Well, there was a little fellow with a camcorder that did a little bit of recording. Nothing that they could put into training. Well, the first night we were sitting around round tables as just kind of a social time, kind of a meet and greet. And I jokingly, well, I first went around the room snapping pictures, so you might want to remember this when you're at meetings, like take pictures of everybody that was there. And I was just doing it for myself so that we could remember who everybody was. But when I got back to the table, I jokingly said, I'm taking these in case the FBI needs them someday. Well, guess where they are now? The FBI. In fact, I think the picture of James was one of my pictures. So that was kind of, you know, a little bit of humor in it. We've got to remember humor. We were supposed to see the working windmill, and we were put off from the morning to the afternoon on Saturday. We got on to buses. There were 2 huge buses and 1 or 2, maybe 3 vans. And first of all, one of the buses got lost, so we had to wait and stall. Then we got out to this place where we pulled into a parking lot of a restaurant that wasn't open yet. And we waited and waited, and we were waiting for somebody to come. I don't know who they were. Well, I went up to James and I said, James, I'm just like a little kid at Christmas. I want to see it. I want to see it. When are we going to go? And he goes, I told everybody to get on the buses, but nobody listened. So I have directed day camp. So I said, come on, everybody, get on the buses. It's time to go. Everybody loaded on the buses, but James wasn't ready for us to leave yet. So pretty soon his wife comes on our bus and says, we have to wait a little while. There's somebody sick in the ladies' room. Well, I saw the person that they claimed was sick outside talking to them just a few minutes before that, so obviously she wasn't in the ladies' room sick. Well, after a while, we did leave, and it was just around a corner and down a little short road. And as we rounded that corner and go across, looking across the field, and we see this, what appeared to be a windmill, tears just rolled. And I couldn't explain. I couldn't stop them. I couldn't speak. Nothing. It was just there. He had awards. He had told, we were sitting in the back row, and he had told one of the inventors not to answer any questions. So that made us like, what's going on here? I want to tell you a little bit about why we did invest. And I think I'll do this by reading my victim's impact statement that I sent to the judge. I did get sent to Los Angeles to testify against him. We called the Maine Securities Office, which we didn't even know about. The son of the person that got us into this was a lawyer, and he found out about it. So we called the Maine Securities Office, and then they sent me to the FBI. And first of all, I want to tell you, it wasn't my money, it was Ray's money. So I'm getting all the credit for it and getting the business, but I want to tell you a little bit about it.
It's my grandchildren's inheritance.
Yeah. Ray and I were victims of James Rivera. We were very excited in late January 2008 when friends told us about an investment in a new company. It was an opportunity to supplement our retirement income once we could build a business. We were excited about the concept of green energy that was renewable. We listened intently to each webinar given by James Rivera and attended the business training and unveiling of the windmill in Las Vegas. We were devastated as the weekend progressed, and we visited the site of the windmill. My tears flowed uncontrollably as we approached the site. The rest of the weekend was a disaster as James tried to assure us that everything was all right. I went on to write to the judge. We were very upset that we had gotten others involved in James Rivera's apparent scheme. These people had invested a total of $100,000. I think it was 5 different people, along with our $30,000. All has been lost. Our $30,000 might have meant that Ray, who was now 74, could retire earlier. It might have covered 8.5 months of assisted living if either of us ever needed it. It might have meant our being able to take several trips after having worked so hard all of our lives. It might have been a little extra educational help for our 12 grandchildren, all things that have been mentioned here before. It also may have meant a little extra help for our children who have had or have medical issues such as multiple sclerosis or cancer. No one knows what might have been, but we know that James Rivera hurt us and a lot of other hard-working people. I knew that James Rivera had hurt us and the others we had involved, but listening to other witnesses and what they had gone through made me realize the scope of the harm that James Rivera had caused only to satisfy his own good.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, okay. We got into the windmill business because of the way it was presented to us. It sounded fantastic. This guy was great at presentation like that. And these windmills were not giant windmills, even though that was in their future plans. But the sails, the windmills were not props, it was more like sails. And they wouldn't kill the birds and the environment, things like that. Very healthy for the environment. And these windmills that's something you could set in your backyard. And they were supposed to be very efficient. They had an inventor inventing the alternator for it, which I guess he invented a great one that would really produce a lot of energy with hardly any movement of the windmill. And the battery system was a great system. There really was a windmill being invented. Like she said, we saw one. But this is not what the real inventor, whose name was Clay, had done. James Rivera was marketing this product for this fellow. Carolyn will probably explain a little about that. But so why did we get into it? Because it sounded great. And we listened to the webinars, and they talked about different things. Going to form his own energy company, so when this excess from your windmill would go back into the grid, we would own the windmills and people would lease them. And then we would get money back on the money that went back into the grid, would get a share of that. And if it was efficient, they said it was going to be, it was good.
I must add one thing. He was riding the coattails of the credibility of others, which was also brought up in the guide.
And I know that we talked in advance and last night, and Ray, you've said that some of the other investors, part of your impression of it was that so many of the other investors were these well-educated and well-to-do people that were also sort of falling for the same scenario.
Yes. The person that got us into that 15 years ago got us into another business that hadn't been started yet in Scottsdale, Arizona. And it was a fantastic business. We still belong in that business. They invited 200 people, 153 people came, and we were the two of that. So we were very fortunate there. So these people had credibility, the ones that got us into the windmills. And they were very excited about the windmills. But as I thought about things, I looked at the type of people who invested in these windmills. Successful businessmen. Foreign countries was at these meetings in Las Vegas. There were lawyers, engineers. They weren't the person off the street as a rule. We might have had a few in there, but very few. And I said, this is unbelievable, really, because they was all business, but I guess they didn't check any better than I did.
Well, this is a sort of a lesson for all of us that there's so many traps along the way and so many things that we need. I know that, Carolyn, you've pointed out to me, and Ray's mentioned how wonderful you are at saving letters and printing things out and taking all these pictures. So,
she is.
Certainly one thing that we can advise for anyone is to make sure that they save their documentation and that they come forward and really make sure that they have the data and the documentation that they need to carry forward their cases. We're going to close now, but I'll give you one last second to say sort of what has this experience done for you? Has it changed your perspective in any way?
I would say, in a way, yes, because we would be a little more skeptical now. We now know of the Office of Main Securities. I would say to you folks, and it was mentioned briefly in the guide, we were victims once. Don't make us a victim again, because I know a lot of times a rape victim has felt like a victim when they have to go to the hospital or go through the whole thing. Try to keep a sense of humor. I know for Catherine, it's pretty hard because that has affected her over years and years and years, and probably multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars. We lost $30,000. but you have to keep a little sense of humor. And one way that we do is, somebody asked me about a month ago if we ever got our money back, and I says, no, but I'm getting it back in trips. So I've been to Los Angeles to testify against James, and we've been to Phoenix, so.
And with that, I'd like you to thank Carolyn and Ray. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
Thank you.
you.
Thank you, Ray.
And Carolyn actually said that to me when we were talking in advance of the trip. She said, well, another trip. I'm getting closer to that 30,000. So it does take a sense of humor. Josh?
So I'm not going to go over these in detail because you have them in front of you, but we created action steps for victims to take. They fall into 4 really important categories, and some of the things we wanted to highlight. Making sure we create a case file. We just heard from Ray and Carolyn about how important it is to document things, and a case file that you have and can carry will do that. Victims need to know their rights. You know these things. They should report as many places as they can and definitely consider civil remedies. You as advocates have to be reference points for resources. You have to help them safety plan. You have to consider adult protective services if it's necessary and refer folks to mental health counselors. We have a resources section that provides you connection to lots of resources. And we also have a connection with a federal financial fraud enforcement task force. So I want to invite Laura Ivkovich to come up on stage and share with us briefly about the task force and about what she does. Many of you know Laura. She's policy analyst for the Office of Victims of Crime. So let's welcome her to the stage.
Thank you, Josh, and Christine, and Mai. Thank you very much. And to the victims and the inspiration for us for the work that we do, thank you for being here today. So Christine asked that I would like to say a few words about some of the resources that are out there. And I said, sure, I'll put up a slide. And our office, the Office for Victims of Crime, if you know us, you know we're a resource office, and that's what we do. So I really appreciate taking a moment. And we have a resource table. I hope you go and see our exhibit and talk further with our resource center. They can make sure you get additional resources. But one thing that matters to victims is having services. And one way that we get those funded is through the Crime Victims Fund, which our office administers. For those of you who don't know, 2 weeks ago, our office announced that a proposed regulation to the Victims of Crime Formula Grant Program. And it's been posted on the Federal Register, and it's now on www.regulations.gov. And it's up for a 60-day comment period that ends October 28th. So for those of you who may not know, these grants that our office authorizes annually to the states comes from convicted federal offenders. It does not come from tax dollars. So it's sort of a justice concept to give back. And we want to make sure that the services that are out there are serving all victims. Obviously, we need services for domestic violence, sexual assault, rape, parents of murdered children programs, support services for a variety, human trafficking, a lot of different crime types. Our regulations are so old they didn't even contemplate identity theft. That wasn't even a crime type back in the day. So we're in a process where we can make our thoughts and our interests known through regulations, and this is one way that you can do it. As an advocate that you are, we invite you to give your thoughts and your impressions about what we should be doing for all victims of crime. So I wanted to mention that. And then also, Josh mentioned the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force. I'm lucky enough to be a co-chair of that Victims' Rights Committee to this task force that was developed in 2009 following some of the toxic mortgage and investment meltdowns that were happening because of Ponzi schemes. And so President Obama had introduced an executive order to develop this task force. And one of our goals of the task force, and I'll read it, is to identify, develop, and promote victim-centered practices for use by federal victim complaint portals and toll-free numbers designed to take consumer complaints from fraud victims and to ensure they are victim-centered and responsive. So when the FINRA Foundation, Education Foundation, and NCVC came together on this action guide for advocates and for the benefit of victims of financial fraud, we were ecstatic because this guide is so useful to traditional victim advocates as well as organizations and agencies who run these federal complaint portals, and there's many. I mean, it was explained, who do I call? There's so many different 1-800 numbers to try and figure out who that is. So there's a stopfraud.gov website that's been developed under this group that collects all of those portals. And we want to educate the folks who are running those, the consumer reps who answer those 1-800 numbers. They might not know it, but they are first responders in a lot of ways, because that might be the only person a victim of financial fraud gets to talk to, because their case may not go anywhere. So we really want to make sure that those who are working with victims in that first responder way have these tools that they need as well to be responsive, to be victim-centered, to be empathetic, and to be helpful as much as possible. So we invited Christine and Josh to make a presentation to our committee back in July, and we realized that these first responders could use this as well, and so we were really pleased that we're able to incorporate this in our goals of the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force. We'll also be helping get this out to the field. Our office funds more than 4,000 victim programs, and we want to make sure all of them have a copy. So that's another thing that we can use as a resource and a tool to get and market it out there. We also were lucky enough to add some resources for older victims, and that's also on our website, stopfraud.gov, and so you might want to download some materials in addition to this Taking Action guide, which we are ecstatic that is out there. So thanks for letting me come up here for just a minute to say how thankful we are for the great work that's been done, the 12 national organizations and 8 federal agencies, the focus groups, and the victims who gave the inspiration to all who worked on this collective effort to develop this guide. We're really thankful for that. So,
thank you, Laura. Now we're going to conclude here in just 1 minute. Laura has been a great supporter. We had a lot of stakeholders that weighed in on this guide. From the Department of Justice, Securities and Exchange Commission, Commodities Futures Trading Commission, several identity theft coalitions, and many others. So it took a lot of work to put this together, all while Josh was studying for law school and taking the bar. The whole week before the bar, I had to try really hard not to call and like give him an edit. But I don't want to take a second just to remind you that the FINRA Foundation does have a table out front as well. I know I've talked to a couple people here that do say that they have some prevention work that they do, or that there's others in their office that do consumer prevention, consumer protection work. Please feel free to take our resources, and I'll highlight the Tricks of the Trade, Outsmarting Investment Fraud movie. It's a documentary. It was airing during the preview this morning, and they're showing it tomorrow in one of the film rooms, but we have it on DVD. You can take it, you can use it, you can watch it just for your own financial benefit. So, and with that, Save and Invest, last thing. Save and Invest is a FINRA Foundation resource. So if you wonder why that logo has been up here all along, it's just easier for people to remember than FINRA Foundation, because then they don't know what FINRA is. And so saveandinvest.org is a resource that we put together, and it's a place that consolidates resources around fraud, and also a lot of for the work that we do with the military financial education. So, and with that, I'll hand it back to Josh and to Mai, I think, and thank you very much for your time today.
I just want to thank Catherine and the Thompsons one more time. It's really brave to come up here and talk about your situation. And so just one big round of applause for them again. Thank you so much. And I hope you have, I know that you are from Arizona, but I hope that you can enjoy the weather and have a good time here too. The FINRA Foundation has really been a wonderful partner, and as I've said throughout the conference, we're really nothing without you all and the partners that we work with. And it's in collaboration that actually we can do all our good work. So I wanted to really thank the FINRA Foundation and Susan Arthur, who's outside, and Christine Kiefer for working with us and figuring this all out. And just to say thank you, and you've been wonderful to work with, and we hope we have many more projects and good things to do in the field together. Thank you. And as always, I've got a few housekeeping lunch is on your own today, but the hotel has created a buffet over in the main building where you checked in. It's $14.99 and it's supposed to be a really nice buffet, so I encourage you to go out there. And also just a reminder that the advances in how to prevent and how to deal with military sex abuse with Major Patton will be in Noble Room at 10:15, so I encourage you to go to that. Thank you.